When the walls of an ancient manor breathe the chill of past sins, only one unauthorized surge of magic can ignite the veil of silence. Will this be the end of their war, or the beginning of a new passion? Relax and immerse yourself in a love story. The rain did not merely fall against the ancient glass of the Malfoy Manor library. It struck the panes like handfuls of sharp gravel, a relentless, punishing rhythm that echoed through the cavernous room. Hermione stood by the towering arched window, her fingers tracing the cold condensation on the glass. The storm outside was a mirror to the suffocating atmosphere within the manor walls, a wild, untamed thing trapped against an impenetrable barrier. 5 years. It had been 5 years since the Ministry's post-war unity edict had bound her signature to his on a piece of enchanted parchment, sealing a marriage that felt more like a beautifully orchestrated Cold War. 5 years of living in opposite wings of a sprawling, silent estate. 5 years of perfectly polite, agonizingly hollow dinners at the ends of a mahogany table long enough to host a small army. Hermione closed her eyes, the scent of beeswax, damp stone, and the tooth of old parchment filling her senses. She smoothed the pristine cuffs of her silk blouse, a grounding habit to mask the slight tremor in her hands. She was exhausted, not from the political maneuverings or the demands of her career, but from the sheer, unrelenting effort of maintaining the armor she wore every single day. A sudden, sharp crackle of static magic made her eyes snap open. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the library creaked, the hinges protesting the intrusion. A small head poked through the gap. Unruly, gravity-defying curls that refused to be tamed, framing a pale, pointed face with eyes the exact piercing shade of a winter sky. Leo. He was 5 years old, a volatile and entirely too observant blend of both his parents. He possessed her unyielding stubbornness and his father's sharp, calculating stillness. But lately, Leo had become something else entirely. A conduit for the unspoken, suffocating atmospheric pressure that blanketed their home. He felt the fracture between them, the vast, icy canyon his parents refused to cross, and his accidental magic had begun to react to it in increasingly destructive ways. "Leo," Hermione said softly, letting go of her cuffs and taking a step toward the shadows of the doorway. "It is past your bedtime. The elves were supposed to read to you." The boy did not answer. He merely stared at her, his small jaw set in a line that was heartbreakingly familiar. Sparks, actual faint blue sparks of raw, undirected magic, danced at the tips of his fingers. He wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze had shifted to the dark corridor behind him. The air in the library suddenly grew heavier, a distinct shift in gravity that made the hairs on the back of Hermione's neck rise. She didn't need to look to know who had arrived. The ambient magic of the manor always bowed, subservient and hushed when its master approached. Draco Malfoy stepped into the dim light of the corridor, stopping just behind their son. He was impeccably dressed, as always, in a dark, tailored suit that seemed to swallow the ambient light. His silver-blonde hair was immaculate, his posture rigidly straight. To the outside world, he was the picture of reformed aristocratic grace. But Hermione knew the signs of his internal fracturing, the almost imperceptible ticking of a muscle in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip of his left hand resting on the silver head of his cane, the way his eyes remained carefully, deliberately blank. He refused the elves. Draco's voice cut through the sound of the rain. It was a low, smooth drawl, devoid of any discernible warmth. Apparently, the story of the Beadle the Bard lacks the necessary thrill. Hermione's spine stiffened. He is restless because the wards are humming with the storm. He is sensitive to the environment, Draco. Sensitive to us, she wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. He is undisciplined. Draco counted flatly, though his hand shifted from his cane to lightly rest on Leo's small shoulder. The gesture was protective, yet entirely rigid. Go to your rooms, Leo. Now. Leo looked up at his father, his grey eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce rebellion. The air pressure in the room spiked violently. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, climbing up Hermione's boots. Leo! No! Hermione started, stepping forward, recognizing the dangerous build-up of static. The boy offered a sharp, mischievous grin that lacked any childhood innocence. He stepped backward, out of the library and into the corridor, slipping out from under Draco's hand. Then he threw his small hands forward. The massive, ancestral oak doors of the library slammed shut with the force of a thunderclap. The sound was deafening. Before either Draco or Hermione could draw their wands, the heavy, ancient iron locks, mechanisms that hadn't been used since the days of the first Malfoy patriarch, ground into place with a visceral, jarring impact. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the furious lashing of the rain against the windows. Hermione stood frozen, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stared at the closed doors, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. She was on the inside, and so was Draco. He stood a few paces from the door, his wand already drawn, the tip glowing with a sharp, blinding white light. He cast a non-verbal Alohomora. The spell hit the iron lock and dissipated into a shower of harmless golden sparks. The wards absorbed the magic without a flinch. "Blood wards," Draco murmured, his voice tight, the smooth veneer cracking just a fraction. He lowered his wand, the silver ring on his index finger biting into his pale skin as his grip tightened. He triggered the primary lockdown sequence. The little menace actually managed to tie his chaotic magic into the foundation stones. "Open it," Hermione said, her voice sounding much thinner than she intended. She crossed the room, the distance between them shrinking rapidly. "You are the head of the house. Command the wards." Draco turned slowly. The sheer physical proximity was startling. They hadn't been this close, breathing the same constrained air in months. Usually they existed in vast spaces, allowing the architecture to act as a shield. Here, in the enclosed shadows of the library, the magnetic pull between them was undeniable. A heavy, suffocating weight pressing against her chest. It requires a synchronized magical signature to override a bloodlock of this magnitude, Draco said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked down at her. "My magic alone will not suffice while the residual chaotic energy of a Malfoy heir is actively jamming the mechanism. We have to wait for his spell to decay." "Wait!" Hermione's voice pitched higher. She forced herself to breathe, desperately trying to ignore the scent of petrichor, dark cedar, and the sharp bite of ozone radiating from him. For how long? Hours, perhaps until dawn. Draco turned his back to her, dismissing her panic with a rigid shift of his shoulders. He walked toward the fireplace, waving a hand to ignite the logs. The flames roared to life, casting long, dancing shadows across his sharp cheekbones. He was shutting her out, again, retreating into that cold, impenetrable fortress he built around his guilt and his perceived unworthiness. Anger, hot and sudden, flared in Hermione's chest, burning away the exhaustion. She marched toward him, the heels of her boots clicking sharply against the stone floor. "You are not going to just stand there and stare at the fire, Draco Malfoy," she snapped, her voice trembling with years of suppressed frustration. "Your son is out there, wandering the manor alone in a storm, and you are going to help me break this ward." Draco froze. He slowly turned his head, the firelight catching the dangerous, icy gleam in his eyes. "My son," he repeated, the words slipping through his teeth like broken glass. "He is out of control, Granger, because he lives in a house haunted by ghosts and a mother who flinches every time the shadows grow too long." The unfairness of the accusation was a physical blow. Hermione stepped directly into his space, completely abandoning her usual calculated distance. The tactile friction in the air was so thick it felt like moving through water. She tilted her chin up, refusing to back down, her brown eyes blazing into his grey ones. "I do not flinch," she whispered fiercely, the space between them now reduced to mere inches. She could see the faint, silvery scar trailing down the side of his neck, disappearing beneath his immaculate collar. "I am holding this family together, while you hide in your study, drowning in whatever penance you think you still owe the world." For a fraction of a second, the mask shattered. Draco's breath hitched, a harsh, jagged sound. His hand twitched, rising a fraction of an inch, as if to grasp her arms, his knuckles bone white. The ambient magic in the room surged, reacting to the violent clash of his restraint and his undeniable magnetic draw toward her. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips, the heat radiating from his body wrapping around her in a suffocating embrace. Hermione's breath caught in her throat. Her hands instinctively rose, hovering just over the lapels of his jacket, hesitating on the precipice of touch. The suspension of time shattered with the violent crack of a log splitting in the fireplace. Draco flinched. The minute, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes vanished, replaced instantly by walls of occlumency, so thick they practically vibrated in the air between them. He stepped back, tearing his gaze away from her lips, his chest rising in a single sharp intake of breath. The withdrawal was physical, a jarring impact that left the space between them freezing cold. Hermione's hands, which had been hovering mere millimeters from the dark wool of his jacket, fell back to her sides. Her fingers curled into tight fists, nails biting into her palms to ground herself against the sudden, dizzying rush of adrenaline and embarrassment. She swallowed hard, forcing her heartbeat to decelerate, though the magnetic pull in the room had not lessened. It had merely coiled tighter, waiting for the next spark. "Do not," Draco said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that barely carried extra the drumming of the rain. He did not look at her. He stared intently at the heavy iron locks of the doors, his profile cast in stark, unforgiving lines by the firelight. "Do not pretend this is anything other than what it is, Granger. A locked room and an unruly child." He only called her Granger when the armor was cracking, when he needed to remind himself of the distance that was supposed to exist between them. "I wasn't pretending anything," Hermione replied, her tone matching his icy cadence. though her internal equilibrium was entirely compromised. She turned her back to him, facing the vast, shadowy rows of bookshelves. The scent of ancient leather and dust motes danced in the gloom, a sharp contrast to the overwhelming presence of dark cedar and ozone that clung to him. "We need to break the ward. Tell me what to do." Silence stretched, taut and fragile. The atmospheric pressure in the library felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of 5 years of unspoken grievances and the terrifying, newly resurrected awareness of their physical proximity. "The ancestral locking mechanism is tied to the bloodline," Draco finally murmured, the sound of his cane softly tapping against the stone floor as he approached the doors again. "Leo's magic is volatile, untrained, but it carries the Malfoy signature. To force the lock to recognize an override, it requires a dual cast, a synchronized magical signature." Hermione turned slowly. "Synchronized? You mean we have to weave our magic?" "Precisely," he said, his grey eyes meeting hers with a bleak, almost hollow expression. "Our magical cores must align perfectly to trick the wards into registering a singular authoritative command. If we are out of sync by even a fraction, the ward will reflect the spell back at us with double the force." Weaving magical cores was not merely a mechanical task. It required a profound level of mental and emotional vulnerability. It meant lowering the shields. It meant allowing another magical entity to brush against the raw, unfiltered essence of one's intent. For two people who spent their lives meticulously hiding their thoughts from one another, it was akin to walking onto a battlefield entirely unarmed. "Fine," Hermione said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her chest. She drew her wand, vine wood, thrumming with a warm, anxious energy. She stepped up beside him, the physical distance between them now less than a foot. "Let us begin." Draco did not move immediately. He stared down at her, his jaw clenched so tightly she thought the bone might snap. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his wand, hawthorn and unicorn hair, a weapon that had seen too much darkness, now glowing with a faint, icy blue luminescence. "On 3, he instructed softly. "The incantation is Resera Claustra. Focus solely on the iron tumblers. Do not push your magic into mine. Let it flow alongside." 1. Hermione closed her eyes, seeking the calm center of her magical core. She visualized the golden warmth of her magic, coaxing it forward, down her arm, pooling at the tip of her wand. 2. She felt the sudden, shocking drop in the temperature around her. Draco was lowering his occlumency shields. The air instantly crackled with a visceral, jagged energy. It was not the cold, indifferent magic he usually projected. It was frantic, heavy with an agonizing, desperate need to protect. The sheer weight of his internal torment washed over her in a suffocating wave, making her breath catch. 3. Resera Claustra. Their voices overlapped, a perfect, chilling harmony in the empty library. Hermione thrust her wand forward, a stream of golden light erupting from the tip. A split second later, Draco's icy blue magic joined hers. When the two streams met, it was not a smooth blending. It was a violent, tactile friction. Hermione gasped as the sensation shot up her arm, a sensation of sharp ice meeting burning embers. The magic twisted together, spiraling toward the ancient iron locks. To maintain the spell, she had to lean into his magic. She felt the edge of his consciousness, a dark, turbulent storm. She felt his profound, paralyzing fear for Leo, wandering alone in the massive, drafty corridors of the manor. And deeper still, buried beneath layers of aristocratic pride and forced apathy, she felt his unbearable, suffocating isolation. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He was not keeping her at a distance because he despised her. He was keeping her at a distance because he believed his proximity was a curse. The golden and blue magic slammed into the iron locks. The heavy tumblers groaned, a metallic shriek that echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. The ward began to fracture. A hairline crack of bright, blinding light appeared across the solid iron. But the emotional exposure was too much. The moment Hermione's magic unconsciously reached out, offering a thread of warmth, of comfort to the desolate landscape of his mind, Draco violently tore his magical connection away. He severed the spell with a brutal, panicked snap. The sudden imbalance caused the residual magic to backfire. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated kinetic energy exploded from the doors. Hermione was thrown backward, her feet leaving the ground. She braced for the harsh impact of the stone floor, but it never came. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, snatching her out of the air with crushing force. Draco's momentum carried them both backward, crashing heavily into the edge of the massive mahogany reading desk. The breath left Hermione's lungs in a sharp rush as she was pinned between the solid, unyielding wood of the desk and the hard, trembling lines of Draco's body. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them moved. The echoes of the magical backlash faded, leaving only the sound of their ragged breathing and the relentless drumming of the rain. Hermione opened her eyes. Draco was hovering right above her. His hands were gripping the edge of the desk on either side of her hips, trapping her completely. His face was mere inches from hers, stripped of every mask, every carefully constructed defense. His chest heaved against hers, the rapid, chaotic beat of his heart thumping wildly against her own ribs. His grey eyes were blown wide, pupils dilated, dark and desperate, searching her face with a raw, terrifying hunger. The air between them was practically incinerating. The magnetic pull had evolved into a gravitational collapse. Hermione's hands, acting entirely of their own volition, slid up his chest, her fingers curling into the fine wool of his lapels. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the fine tremor running through his arms. "Draco," she breathed. A plea, a question, a surrender all wrapped into 2 syllables. His gaze dropped to her lips again. He leaned in, the distance closing, until she could feel the ghost of his breath against her mouth, smelling of mint and dark magic. The tension was exquisite, a physical ache that tightened low in her stomach. Then, the familiar, devastating defensive wall slammed back down behind his eyes. He recoiled as if she had burned him. Pushing off the desk, he staggered back 2 steps, his hands dropping sharply to his sides, his knuckles instantly whitening as he clenched his fists. The tremor in his frame remained, but his face had frozen back into a mask of pristine, terrifying indifference. "Your focus was entirely misaligned," he said, his voice clipped, harsh, dripping with a venom that was clearly directed inward but wielded against her. "You let your mind wander, Granger. Emotional bleeding has no place in complex ward breaking." Hermione slowly pushed herself off the desk, her legs trembling slightly. The coldness of the room rushed back in to fill the space his body had occupied. She smoothed her silk cuffs with shaking fingers, the sting of his sudden retreat burning hotter than the magical backlash. "My focus was perfectly aligned," she shot back, her voice thick with unshed frustration. She stepped toward him, refusing to let him hide behind his cruelest defense mechanism. "It was you who pulled away. You panicked the moment you felt—" "I felt nothing but your lack of control," he interrupted smoothly, turning his back on her to face the glowing embers of the fireplace. He picked up his cane from where it had fallen, his movements stiff, robotic. "We will have to wait for the boy's magic to decay. Do not attempt to engage my core again." He stood there, a dark, solitary pillar against the firelight, entirely closed off. But Hermione stared at the rigid line of his shoulders, the memory of his frantic heartbeat still echoing against her chest. He was a liar. And as she looked at the heavy, immovable doors trapping them inside, she realized they had hours of the night left to endure the silence. The grandfather clock, nestled in the darkest corner of the library, ticked, a hollow echo that seemed to measure the vast, expanding wasteland between them. Outside, the rain continued its violent assault against the glass, but inside, the silence was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, pressing against Hermione's eardrums and making the air feel thick and unbreathable. She remained where Draco had left her, her back resting lightly against the edge of the mahogany desk. Across the room, Draco stood perfectly still before the hearth. The fire cast long, flickering shadows across the severe lines of his profile, painting him in shades of gold and ash. He had retreated entirely behind his impregnable walls, an aristocrat carved from ice, but Hermione's skin still hummed with the phantom heat of his chest pressed against hers. She watched the rigid line of his spine, the unnatural stillness of his shoulders. Her eyes drifted down to his left hand, hanging rigidly by his side. The silver ring on his index finger caught the firelight. His knuckles were entirely white, and a fine, uncontrollable tremor vibrated through his fingers. He was gripping his cane with enough force to splinter the polished wood. He was not as unaffected as he wanted her to believe. The visceral alignment of their magic had terrified him, not because she had lost control, but because she had seen him. She had brushed against the desolate, starving core of his magic and offered warmth, and that was the one thing Draco Malfoy could not endure. Hermione pushed herself away from the desk. She refused to let the night dissolve into this agonizing stalemate. If they were trapped here until dawn, she would not spend the hours staring at his back. "There is an architectural globe in the restricted section," she said, her voice deliberately quiet, slicing through the heavy static in the room. "An antique ward map of the estate. Your father used it to monitor the grounds." Draco did not turn, but the minute stiffening of his posture told her he was listening. "It requires a blood offering from the head of the house to activate," he replied, his tone flat, devoid of the jagged edge from moments before. "It is ancient magic, Granger, unpredictable." "It is a scrying tool, Draco, not a dark artifact," Hermione countered, walking slowly toward the towering shelves that housed the oldest Malfoy grimoires. The scent of old leather, dust motes, and dried sage grew stronger here, masking the sharp scent of ozone that still lingered from their failed spell. "If we cannot break the doors, We must at least verify where Leo is. The manor is too large. If his magic spikes again near the eastern wing, the structural integrity of the old corridors might fail. She heard the soft, reluctant tap of his cane against the stone. He was following her. Hermione navigated the narrow aisles between the towering bookshelves until she reached a small circular alcove. In the center sat a pedestal of black marble, supporting a large sphere of clouded crystal. Faint, dormant veins of silver ran through the glass, waiting to be awakened. Draco stepped into the alcove beside her. The space was incredibly tight. To stand before the globe, they had to be shoulder to shoulder. The atmospheric pressure immediately intensified, the air growing thick with that familiar, dangerous magnetic pull. Hermione focused entirely on the clouded crystal, desperately ignoring the heat radiating from his body and the intoxicating scent of dark cedar and rain that enveloped him. He reached out, his hand hovering over the glass. Without a word, he drew his wand and made a swift, shallow cut across his palm. A single drop of crimson blood fell onto the apex of the globe. The crystal hissed. The silver veins ignited, glowing with a brilliant, pulsing light. Slowly, the cloudy interior cleared, revealing a perfect three-dimensional miniature rendering of Malfoy Manor. Every corridor, every grand staircase, every hidden passage materialized in glowing silver light. And there, moving slowly down the grand corridor of the second floor, was a single, bright spark of chaotic blue magic. Hermione exhaled a shaky breath, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. He is on the second floor, moving toward the portrait gallery. Draco leaned closer to the globe, his eyes fixed on the small wandering spark. His arm brushed against hers, a fleeting, almost imperceptible contact, but it sent a jolt of tactile friction straight up her spine. He didn't pull away. "He is pacing," Draco murmured, his voice stripped of its usual aristocratic drawl, leaving only a raw, unshielded exhaustion. The blue light, it is too bright. His magical core is entirely unsettled. "He is frightened, Draco," Hermione said softly, turning her head slightly to look at him. They were so close she could see the faint shadows beneath his eyes, the absolute exhaustion etched into the corners of his mouth. He doesn't understand why his parents treat this house like a chessboard, carefully maneuvering around each other to avoid contact. Draco's jaw locked. He stared relentlessly at the blue spark in the globe. "He is safe because we maintain order, structure." "You maintain distance," Hermione corrected, the words slipping out before she could temper them. The need to break through his defenses was a physical ache in her chest. "You think you are protecting him from your past, but you are only teaching him how to build walls." "I am teaching him survival," Draco snapped, his voice dropping to a dangerous silken whisper. He finally turned his head to look at her. The grey of his eyes was stormy, turbulent with a grief she was rarely allowed to witness. "Do you think I do not see it? The way his magic darkens when he is angry? The way the shadows in this house bend toward him? He carries my blood, Granger, and with it, every wretched inherited stain of this family." The confession hung in the tight space of the alcove, heavy and devastating. It was the absolute truth of his isolation. He wasn't punishing her. He was quarantining himself, terrified that the darkness he believed resided within him would inevitably poison their son. Hermione's heart shattered against her ribs. The anger that had fueled her for 5 years evaporated, leaving behind a profound, desperate tenderness. She realized then that his coldness was not a weapon. It was a shield to protect the two people he valued most. She didn't think. She simply acted on the overwhelming instinct to anchor him. Hermione lifted her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly before she pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. Draco froze. A sharp, ragged intake of breath tore from his throat. His entire body went rigid beneath her touch, the fine wool of his jacket soft against her skin, the rapid, chaotic thud of his heart hammering against her palm. He looked down at her hand, his expression a terrifying mixture of panic and absolute starving reverence. "He is not you, Draco," she whispered fiercely, stepping a fraction closer, refusing to let him retreat into the cold. She let her thumb brush gently against his lapel. "And you are not the ghosts that haunt this house. Your magic earlier, it wasn't dark. It was terrified. You love him so much it is breaking you." He slowly closed his eyes, his head dropping a fraction of an inch toward her. The tension in his jaw relaxed, and for a singular, breathless moment, he didn't pull away. He leaned into the pressure of her hand, an infinitesimal surrender that caused the atmospheric pressure in the alcove to shift from hostile to agonizingly intimate. His hand, the one that had been clenched by his side, slowly rose. His fingers brushed against her waist, a hesitant, feather-light touch that sent a shiver racing across her skin. Then, the architectural globe between them flared with a blinding, violent crimson light. Draco's eyes snapped open, the vulnerability instantly replaced by raw terror. He ripped his gaze from Hermione, staring down at the crystal. The small blue spark that represented Leo had vanished. In its place, the entire western wing of the miniature manor, the oldest, structurally unstable section of the estate, was flashing an angry, pulsating red. The glass of the globe grew hot, emitting a high-pitched, terrifying hum. "What did he do?" Hermione gasped, dropping her hand from Draco's chest, the intimate moment completely shattered by the sudden spike of dread. "He isn't in the portrait gallery anymore," Draco said, his voice entirely devoid of color. He looked up, his grey eyes wide and fixed on the heavy iron doors of the library. "He just breached the sealed catacombs." The crimson flare from the globe cast a bloody hue over the alcove, turning the silver blonde of Draco's hair into a ghostly, metallic white. The air, which only a second ago had been heavy with the possibility of a shared breath, was now charged with the sharp metallic tang of an impending magical collapse. "The catacombs," Hermione whispered, her voice barely audible over the high-pitched vibration of the crystal sphere. "Draco, the lower levels are tied to the ancient foundations. If he's there alone—" "He isn't just there," Draco interrupted, his voice reaching a pitch of strained clarity that was more terrifying than a shout. He shoved his wand into his sleeve and gripped the edge of the pedestal. "He has triggered the ancestral deep storage wards. They weren't designed to protect, they were designed to contain. To a 5-year-old's magic, they will look like a challenge." He moved with a sudden, violent grace, turning toward the locked library doors. The limp he usually carried, a souvenir from a war that refused to end, was forgotten in the wake of pure parental adrenaline. Hermione was at his heels, the sound of her rapid breathing and the rustle of her silk sleeves the only things filling the narrow gaps between his echoing footsteps. They reached the doors, those immovable slabs of oak and iron that had held them captive for hours. Draco didn't hesitate this time. He didn't ask for a synchronized cast. He slammed his palm against the wood, right over the iron lock, his skin sizzling as the blood ward recognized the raw, unshielded desperation of the master of the house. "Open!" he roared. Not a spell, but a command of sheer ancestral authority. The iron groaned, a sound like a giant's teeth grinding together. The lock didn't slide. It shattered. Fragments of blackened metal flew across the corridor as the doors burst outward, slamming into the stone walls of the hallway. The corridor beyond was a nightmare of shifting shadows. The manor, sensing the instability at its core, was reacting. The candles in the wall sconces flickered with a sickly green light, and the very floor beneath their feet seemed to tilt and sway like the deck of a ship in a gale. "Leo!" Hermione screamed, her voice echoing down the vaulted hallway, lost in the roar of the wind that had somehow found its way inside the house. "Don't waste your breath, Hermione," Draco said, his hand catching hers as they rounded a corner toward the service stairs. His grip was crushing, a desperate tether of tactile friction that sent a jolt of grounding energy through her. "The wards down there are acoustic dampening. He won't hear us. We have to reach the anchor point." They descended the spiral stone stairs, moving deeper into the belly of the manor, where the air grew damp and smelled of ancient earth and stagnant magic. The further they went, the more the atmospheric pressure increased, a physical weight that made it difficult to draw air into their lungs. The walls here were sweating, beads of dark moisture clinging to the rough-hewn stone. As they reached the entrance to the catacombs, a heavy iron gate that led to the family crypts and the vaults beneath, they found the air shimmering with a violent electric blue haze. There, in the center of the wide vaulted chamber, stood Leo. He looked impossibly small against the backdrop of the massive stone sarcophagi and the towering shelves of dark artifacts. His hair was a wild halo of curls, and his eyes were wide, glowing with the same terrifying blue light that saturated the room. His small hands were thrust out, and from his fingertips ropes of chaotic magic were lashing out, striking the ancient protective runes carved into the ceiling. "Leo, stop!" Hermione cried, moving to run toward him. Draco's arm shot out, catching her around the waist and pulling her back into the shadow of a stone archway. "Don't! If you break the circuit now, the feedback will liquefy his magical core. Look at the runes, Hermione." She looked. The ancient Norse symbols were glowing a malevolent, pulsing violet. They were absorbing Leo's magic, feeding on the boy's raw power and growing stronger, preparing to retaliate. The boy was caught in a feedback loop. The more he tried to push the scary magic away, the more the room demanded of him. Leo's face was pale, tear-streaked, and twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He wasn't being naughty. He was drowning. "We have to ground him," Hermione said, her mind racing through every theoretical text on magical resonance she had ever mastered. "He's acting as a conductor. We need to become the insulation." "Draco, we have to bridge the gap." Draco looked at the boy, and for the first time, Hermione saw the man's soul laid bare. The guilt, the self-loathing, the fear of his own blood. It all vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective light that made him look like a warrior out of legend. "If we do this," Draco whispered, his gaze shifting to her, "there is no going back. Our magic will be permanently intertwined. You will feel everything, Hermione. Every shadow I carry, every sin." "I don't care about your sins, Draco," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense frequency that cut through the roar of the chamber. She reached out, her fingers tangling with his, her palm pressing firmly against his. "I only care about our son, and I've always known your shadows. I'm not afraid of the dark." Draco's eyes searched hers for one heartbeat, finding the truth in her steady, unwavering brown gaze. He let out a long, shaky exhale, and the tension in his jaw finally, completely broke. "Together," he said. They stepped out from behind the archway, moving as one. The air in the chamber hissed as they entered the blue field of Leo's magic. It felt like walking through a cloud of needles, 1,000 tiny pricks of static electricity dancing over their skin. They positioned themselves on either side of the boy, but they didn't touch him yet. They joined their free hands above his head, forming a triangular circuit. "On my mark," Draco commanded, his voice booming with the authority of a Malfoy, but softened by the love of a father. "Focus on the warmth, Hermione. Focus on the library, the fire, the feeling of being safe. Now." They let their magic go. It wasn't like the library. There was no fighting, no friction, no jarring impact. Perhaps it was the shared terror for their child, or perhaps the walls had simply been battered down too many times that night. Their magic fused instantly, a torrent of molten gold and shimmering silver that wrapped around Leo like a cocoon. The sensation was overwhelming. Hermione gasped as Draco's consciousness flooded into hers. It was like a dam breaking. She felt his immense, crushing love for her, a love so profound and so terrified of itself that he had spent 5 years trying to starve it to death. She felt the moment he had first seen her in the library after the war, the way his heart had nearly stopped, because he thought he had lost the right to even look at her. She felt his pride in Leo, his fear of failing them, and the agonizing, constant cold of his self-imposed exile. And in return, Draco felt her. He felt her stubborn, unyielding hope. He felt the way she had looked at his closed doors for years, wishing he would just once ask her to stay. He felt her vulnerability, her loneliness, and the fierce, burning heat of her desire for him that she had buried under a mountain of logic and ministry reports. Leo's scream of terror turned into a soft sigh of relief. The blue light began to fade, absorbed into the gold and silver of his parents' combined strength. The violent runes on the ceiling dimmed, their hunger sated by the sheer volume of stable, grounded magic being poured into the room. The boy's knees buckled. Hermione and Draco moved simultaneously, dropping to their knees and catching him before he hit the stone. The magical circuit broke, but the connection remained. The chamber fell into a profound, ringing silence. The only sound was the heavy, wet thud of water dripping from the ceiling and the ragged, synchronized breathing of the 3 people huddled on the floor. Leo was unconscious, his head lolling against Hermione's shoulder, his breathing deep and even. He was safe. Hermione looked up. Draco was inches away, his arms wrapped around both her and the boy. His face was wet, not from the damp of the catacombs, but from silent, shaking tears. He didn't look away. He didn't pull back. He didn't put the mask back on. He reached out, his hand trembling as he tucked a stray wild curl behind Hermione's ear. His touch was no longer hesitant. It was a claim, a desperate, silent acknowledgement of the bridge they had finally crossed. "I saw," he whispered, his voice cracked and raw. "I felt it all, Hermione. I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." Hermione leaned her forehead against his, her eyes closing as she inhaled the scent of him. No longer just cedar and rain, but something warmer, something that smelled like home. "Don't be sorry," she breathed, her hand coming up to cup his jaw, the stubble of his beard rough against her palm. "Just don't leave me in the dark again." Draco let out a jagged, broken laugh and pulled them both closer, his forehead resting against hers as the shadows of the manor finally retreated, defeated by the dawn that was beginning to bleed through the high, narrow vents of the vaults. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the terrifying, beautiful weight of everything they had finally stopped running from. The silence of the catacombs was no longer the tomb-like stillness of the library. It was heavy, yes, but it was the weight of a fever that had finally broken. Hermione sat on the cold stone floor, her legs tucked beneath her, cradling Leo's sleeping form. The boy's breathing was a rhythmic, soft huff against her collarbone, a miracle of mundane biology after the terrifying supernatural display they had just witnessed. Draco remained on his knees beside them, his presence a dark, solid anchor in the gloom. The silver-blue light of the wards had vanished, replaced by the faint, greyish smudge of pre-dawn light filtering down from the ventilation shafts. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't pull away. His shoulder was pressed firmly against hers, his heat seeping through her silk sleeve, a grounding, tactile friction that made her dizzy. He reached out, his fingers tracing the edge of Leo's jaw with a reverence so profound it was painful to watch. The man who had entered these vaults was a fortress of ice. The man sitting here now was stripped bare, his skin looking almost translucent in the half-light. "He's okay," Hermione whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the vastness of the chamber. "He's more than okay," Draco murmured, his gaze finally lifting from the boy to her. The grey of his eyes was no longer a storm. It was a vast, open sea, turbulent but no longer hidden. "He's powerful, far more than I was at his age, and far more volatile." He let his hand drop from Leo, but instead of retreating, he rested his palm on the stone floor, inches from Hermione's knee. She could see the faint tremor in his fingers. "We have to take him upstairs," she said, though she made no move to get up. The exhaustion was finally setting in, a leaden weight in her bones. "The manor it's quiet now. The wards have settled." "They've settled because they finally recognize a master," Draco said, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic cadence. "But not just me. You. They recognize the union. The magic we used. It wasn't just a shield, Hermione. It was an integration. You've been the lady of this house for years by law, but tonight the stones themselves accepted you." Hermione looked at him, startled by the gravity in his tone. "I didn't do it for the house, Draco." "I know," he breathed. He shifted, closing the small gap between them until their thighs touched. The contact was electric, a sudden surge of atmospheric pressure that made her heart gallop. "You did it for him. You've always done everything for him, while I sat in my rooms and convinced myself that my absence was a gift to you both." The internal monologue he had kept locked away for half a decade was pouring out of him now, a visceral alignment of truth that he could no longer suppress. Hermione felt the phantom echo of his magic, the guilt she had sensed during their merger. It was a dark, roiling thing, a rot in the foundation of his self-image that he had nurtured with agonizing care. "You thought you were protecting us from your shadow," she said, her voice steady. She shifted Leo slightly, freeing one hand to reach out. She didn't hesitate this time. She brushed her fingertips against the back of his hand, the contact sparking a sharp magnetic pull. "But the shadow only grows when you're alone, Draco. When you share the light, the shadows have nowhere to hide." Draco's breath hitched. He turned his hand over, catching hers, his fingers lacing through hers with a desperate, crushing strength. His skin was fever-hot against hers. He looked down at their joined hands, the pale, elegant lines of his fingers intertwined with her smaller, ink-stained ones. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to be the man you deserve. I am haunted, Hermione. Every time I look at my arm, every time I walk past my father's portrait, I feel like a fraud in my own life." "Then stop trying to be the man I deserve," Hermione countered, leaning toward him until her forehead almost touched his. "Just be the man who stays. Be the father Leo needs. Be the person who stops apologizing for breathing the same air as me." He let out a jagged, choked laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. The world shrunk down to the space between them, the scent of him, the sound of his ragged breathing, the warmth of their joined hands. The tension was no longer a barrier, it was a bridge. But as the first true ray of sunlight pierced the chamber, a sudden, sharp coldness washed over them. The heavy iron gate of the catacombs, which had been standing open, suddenly groaned. The ancient metal shrieked as it began to swing shut of its own accord. Draco was on his feet in a heartbeat, his wand snapping into his hand with a lethal, fluid motion. He shoved Hermione and Leo behind the safety of a stone sarcophagus, just as the gate slammed shut with a finality that shook the floor. "What is it?" Hermione hissed, clutching Leo to her chest. Draco didn't answer immediately. He stood in the center of the chamber, his body coiled like a spring, his eyes narrowed as he watched the shadows near the entrance. The air began to shimmer again, but it wasn't the blue of Leo's magic. It was a sickly, pale green, the color of old, stagnant curses. "The manor is testing the new equilibrium," Draco said, his voice like iron. "The deep wards, they've been dormant too long. They don't just accept a change in power, they demand a proof of intent." A low, guttural hum began to vibrate through the stone walls. It wasn't Leo's chaotic energy. It was the sentient, ancestral malice of the Malfoy line, a lingering echo of his ancestors who viewed any dilution of their magic as an infection. The green mist began to coalesce into a shape, a tall, flickering shadow that bore a terrifying resemblance to Lucius Malfoy, though it lacked a face. It was a manifestation of the house's darkest memories, a guardian of the old ways. "Draco," Hermione warned, seeing the way his knuckles whitened on his wand. "Stay back," he commanded, but there was no coldness in his voice this time. There was only a fierce, possessive protectiveness. The shadow moved, gliding across the floor with a terrifying, silent grace. As it approached, the temperature in the room plummeted. Hermione felt the doubt creeping back into the edges of her mind. The old fear that Draco would choose the easy path, the path of his ancestors, rather than the difficult road of redemption. The shadow reached out a misty, clawed hand toward Draco. It whispered, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a grave, offering him the old power, the old safety of his solitude. It promised him that if he let go of the mudblood and the child who was unpure, the house would grant him peace. For a terrifying moment, Draco didn't move. He stood perfectly still, the green light reflecting in his eyes, making them look hollow and grey. Hermione's heart plummeted. The doubt was a physical weight, a seesaw of trust that threatened to tip into the abyss. "Draco, please," she whispered. He didn't look at her. He looked directly at the shadow. "You are nothing but a memory," Draco said, his voice echoing with a power that wasn't granted by the house, but forged in the fire of the night's events. "And this house belongs to my son, and to my wife." He didn't cast a hex. He didn't use a curse. He reached out with his left hand, the one marked by the faded, ugly scar of the dark mark, and thrust it directly into the center of the green mist. "I reject the silence," he roared. A blinding flash of pure white gold light erupted from his palm. It was the magic they had shared, the synchronized, empathetic core they had created to save Leo. The light was anathema to the shadow. The green mist shrieked, a sound of tearing silk, and evaporated into nothingness. The iron gate flew open, the hinges nearly tearing from the stone. The sickly green light vanished, replaced by the warm golden glow of a true sunrise flooding down the stairs. Draco slumped, his shoulders dropping, his wand hand trembling violently. He didn't turn around. He stood there, his back to her, his head bowed. "Draco?" Hermione asked, her heart in her throat. "Did you feel it?" he asked, his voice a ghost of a sound. "The way it tried to pull me back, the way it told me I was already dead." "But you didn't go," she said, standing up and shifting the sleeping Leo in her arms. She walked toward him, her footsteps soft on the stone. "I almost did," he whispered, finally turning to face her. "Doubt. It's still there, Hermione. Doubt. It's still there, Hermione. It doesn't just go away because the sun came up." The warmth of the morning was a lie. The coldness had returned, but this time it was the coldness of reality. They had saved their son. They had faced the house, but the 5 years of distance and the decades of prejudice was still a mountain between them. Draco looked at her, and for a second the repulsion was back, not for her, but for himself. He looked at his hand, the one that had touched the shadow as if it were contaminated. "Take him upstairs," Draco said, his voice flat and distant once more. "The house is safe now. I need to be alone." He turned and walked toward the darkest corner of the vaults, disappearing into the shadows before she could even say his name. The seesaw had tipped again, and as Hermione carried their son toward the light, the victory felt as cold as the stone beneath her feet. The morning light in the master wing of the manor was a cruel, clinical white. It exposed the dust motes dancing in the air of rooms that had been curated but never truly lived in. Hermione sat on the edge of Leo's bed, her fingers mindfully stroking the silk duvet. The boy had finally succumbed to a deep, natural sleep, his small face peaceful, oblivious to the fact that his parents' world had been dismantled and reconstructed 3 times over in a single night. Hermione's own body felt like a leaden weight. Her silk blouse was wrinkled and stained with the damp of the catacombs. Her hair was a wild, frizzy halo of curls that had long since escaped its pins. But she couldn't sleep. The coldness of Draco's final withdrawal in the vaults was a needle in her heart. He had rejected the shadow, yes, but then he had rejected the light she offered, retreating back into the safety of his own self-loathing. She stood up, her joints popping in the silence. She needed to find him. Not because she had more words to say, but because the silence between them had become a physical entity, a thick, suffocating fog that would only grow if she allowed it to settle. She didn't find him in his study. She didn't find him in the library or the dining hall. It wasn't until she reached the far end of the western gallery, a place where the floorboards were still scarred from the war, that she saw the door to the balcony standing ajar. The air outside was crisp, smelling of wet earth and the sharp, clean scent of the highlands. Draco was leaning against the stone balustrade, his back to the door. He had shed his jacket. His white shirt was translucent against the morning sun. His sleeves rolled up to reveal the pale, lean muscles of his forearms. He wasn't moving. He looked like a statue, a permanent fixture of the Malfoy architecture. Hermione stepped onto the balcony. The click of her heels against the stone was a jarring impact in the quiet. Draco didn't turn, but his shoulders stiffened, a visceral reaction to her proximity. "Leo is still sleeping," she said, her voice sounding hollow to her own ears. "Good," Draco replied. His voice was a low, sandpaper rasp. "He needs the rest. His magic will be fragile for a few days." Hermione walked to the balustrade, stopping a few feet away from him. She followed his gaze out over the sprawling estate. The mist was lifting from the black lake, and the hedges of the labyrinth were beginning to glow with a vibrant emerald life. It was beautiful, and yet, standing here with him, it felt like a gilded cage. "Why are you out here, Draco?" she asked softly. He let out a short, bitter huff of air. "I am waiting for the feeling of being tainted to pass. It's taking longer than usual this morning." "You aren't tainted," she countered, her anger flaring with a sudden, sharp heat. She closed the distance between them, ignoring the way he flinched. She grabbed his left arm, the one he always kept slightly tucked away, and pulled it into the light. The faded, distorted skull and snake of the Darkmark were a dull grey against his skin. "This is just ink and old mistakes. It's not who you are." Draco finally turned his head to look at her. His eyes were bloodshot, the silver irises looking like shattered glass. "Is it? Because every time I try to move forward, every time I think I can touch you without ruining you, the house reminds me of what I was, what I am capable of." "You saved us," she whispered, her hand sliding down his arm to grip his wrist. She could feel the rapid, frantic thrum of his pulse beneath the skin. "You chose us over the shadow. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "It means I'm a man who can't even control his own home without nearly killing his family," he snapped, his voice rising in a rare display of raw, unpolished emotion. He tore his arm away from her grip and paced the small length of the balcony. "You should have left 5 years ago, Hermione. You should have taken the boy and disappeared into the Muggle world, where the air doesn't smell like rot and old blood." "I stayed because I wanted to be here." she shouted back, the frustration of half a decade finally boiling over. "I stayed because I love you, you idiot. Even when you were a wall of ice, even when you treated me like a ghost in your halls. I stayed because I saw the man who was screaming for help behind those occlumency shields." The word love hit the air like a physical blow. The silence that followed was so absolute, it felt as though the world had stopped spinning. Draco froze. He looked at her as if she had just struck him. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. The atmospheric pressure on the balcony spiked, a heavy magnetic pull that made the air feel electric. Hermione felt the sudden, frantic need to straighten her cuffs, her fingers fumbling with the silk as she realized what she had finally said. She had meant to be strategic, to be patient, but the nights of tension had stripped her of her defenses. She felt emotionally vulnerable, exposed in the harsh morning light. You love me?" Draco asked, the words sounding like they were being dragged over gravel. "I have for a very long time," she said, her voice trembling now. She forced herself to look him in the eye, to let him see the raw, unshielded truth of her. "And I am tired, Draco. I am so tired of fighting for someone who won't even fight for himself." She turned to leave, her heart a heavy, aching lump in her chest. She had given him the ultimate weapon to use against her, and she couldn't bear to see him retreat again. She had only taken 2 steps when his hand shot out, catching her by the shoulder. He didn't just stop her. He spun her around with a desperate, jarring force, pinning her back against the stone pillar of the balcony door. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. Before she could recover, Draco was there, his body a solid, trembling weight against hers. He slammed his hands onto the stone on either side of her head, caging her. His face was inches from hers, his eyes wide and terrifyingly dark. The masks were gone. The walls were rubble. There was only a raw, starving hunger in his gaze that made her knees go weak. "Do you have any idea," he hissed, his breath hot against her skin, "what it does to me to hear you say that? To know that I have spent 5 years wasting every second I could have had with you." "Then stop wasting it," she breathed, her hands rising to rest against his chest. She could feel the frantic, heavy thud of his heart, a rhythmic, visceral alignment with her own. He leaned in, his forehead dropping against hers. A fine tremor was running through his entire frame. The tactile friction between them was so intense, it felt like the air might ignite. His scent, cedar, rain, and the metallic tang of magic, wrapped around her like a shroud. "I am a broken man, Hermione," he whispered into the small space between their lips. "Then let me help you put the pieces back together," she replied. Draco let out a jagged, broken sound, half sob, half laugh. He tilted his head, his gaze dropping to her mouth with a focus so intense it was almost physical. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. He hovered there, in the agonizing space of the almost, his breath mingling with hers. His hand moved from the stone, his fingers trailing up the column of her neck, his thumb brushing against her jawline. The touch was featherlight, a hesitant, reverent gesture that spoke of 1,000 unspoken apologies. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. "I don't care," she whispered back. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the silver-blonde hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. The moment their lips met, the world vanished. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was an explosion. It was the release of 5 years of suppressed desire, of anger, of grief, and of a love that had been forged in the dark. It was a visceral, desperate collision. Draco groaned into her mouth, his hands sliding down to her waist, pulling her flush against him as if he were trying to merge their very souls. The heat was incinerating. Hermione's hands clutched at his shoulders, her nails digging into his shirt as she anchored herself to him. He tasted of mint and the lingering bitterness of the night, but beneath it was a sweetness that made her head spin. The magnetic pull was finally satisfied. The atmospheric pressure had equalized. Draco pulled back just an inch, his eyes closed, his forehead still pressed to hers. His breathing was ragged, his lips swollen and red. For the first time, he looked truly alive. Hermione, he breathed, the name a sacred thing on his tongue. But even as the warmth spread through her, a sudden, sharp cry from inside the manor shattered the moment. "Mummy! Daddy!" It was Leo. And his voice wasn't filled with the mischief of the night before. It was filled with a new, strange kind of wonder. Draco and Hermione broke apart, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared alarm and something that looked suspiciously like hope. They hurried back into the room, their hands instinctively finding each other, fingers interlacing in a tight, unbreakable grip. They reached Leo's room to find the boy standing in the center of the bed. He wasn't crying. He was pointing at the window. The frost that had blanketed the glass from the night's storm wasn't melting. It was shifting. Under the influence of the boy's now stabilized magic, the ice was forming into intricate, shimmering shapes. White roses, lions, and dragons, all dancing together in a delicate, frozen ballet. "Look," Leo whispered, his grey eyes wide. "The house is happy." Draco looked at the window, then down at Hermione. He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. The coldness was gone. The shadows were still there, tucked away in the corners of the manor, but they no longer felt like a threat. They were just part of the architecture. "Yes, Leo," Draco said, his voice steady and warm. "The house is finally happy." He looked at Hermione, and in the quiet of the morning, he leaned down and kissed her again, a soft, lingering promise that this was only the beginning. The afternoon sun had begun to dip toward the jagged horizon of the highlands, casting long, honey-coloured fingers of light across the nursery floor. For the first time in memory, the oppressive atmospheric pressure that had governed Malfoy Manor for generations seemed to have lifted. The air was lighter, smelling of the lavender polish the house elves were using to scrub away the residue of the storm, and the faint, sweet scent of the tea Hermione had brought in for Leo. Leo sat on the rug, his small fingers carefully manipulating a set of enchanted wooden blocks. He was no longer a storm-tossed vessel of chaotic energy. His magic hummed in a low, contented frequency, manifesting only in the way the blocks hovered slightly as he moved them. He was peaceful, but Hermione felt the tremor of exhaustion deep in her own marrow. She was sitting in the velvet armchair by the window, a book open in her lap, but her eyes were fixed on the door. Since their encounter on the balcony, Draco had been a ghost of a different kind. He had retreated not into his study, but into the practicalities of the estate, meeting with the wardmasters and the healers to ensure the structural integrity of the manor was restored. Yet, the memory of his lips against hers, the raw, desperate hunger of it, clung to her skin like a second coat. The door creaked open. Draco stepped into the room. He had changed into a fresh shirt of crisp white linen, though he hadn't bothered with a tie. His hair was damp, brushed back from his forehead, and the severe lines of his face seemed to have softened into something approaching tranquility. Leo looked up, a bright, toothy grin breaking across his face. "Father, did you fix the big gates?" Draco crossed the room, his gait slow and deliberate. He knelt beside the boy, ignoring the protest of his injured leg. "I did, Leo. The wards are singing again. They won't be trapping us in the library anymore." He looked up at Hermione. The gaze was intense, a magnetic pull that made the book in her lap slip an inch. There was no coldness left in him, only a quiet, simmering heat that promised a conversation they hadn't yet finished. "He should eat something substantial," Draco said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate register that made the hairs on Hermione's arms stand up. "The elves have prepared a meal in the small sunroom. I thought perhaps we could eat together, properly." "Together," Hermione repeated, the word feeling like a landmark. "Yes." "No mahogany tables between us," Draco promised, his thumb tracing a pattern on the floorboards. "Just us." The meal was a quiet affair, but the silence was no longer a weapon. It was a shared breath. They sat in the sunroom, a space filled with lush green plants and glass walls that looked out over the gardens. Leo chattered about the dragons he wanted to see, and for the first time, Draco engaged, telling stories of the Malfoy stables with a wit and warmth that Hermione hadn't seen since before the war. As the sun finally vanished, leaving the sky a bruised purple, the house elves took Leo to bed. The transition was seamless, the boy exhausted by the day's emotional expenditure. Then there were only two. The sunroom was now lit only by the soft, flickering glow of a few enchanted lanterns. The shadows grew long, but they no longer felt like predators. Hermione stood by the glass, watching the moon rise over the black lake. She felt the shift in the air before she heard him move, the familiar, electric charge of his presence. Draco stood behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, the scent of cedar and mint wrapping around her. "I spent years thinking that if I let you in, I would destroy you," he whispered, his voice vibrating in the small space between them. "I thought my love was a form of rot. I didn't realize that by keeping you out, I was the one becoming hollow." Hermione turned slowly. The light from the lanterns caught the silver in his eyes, making them look like molten metal. "You were never hollow, Draco. You were just buried under the weight of a name you didn't choose." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as his fingers brushed against the silk of her sleeve. He followed the line of her arm up to her shoulder, his touch lingering, a tactile exploration of a territory he had finally been given permission to enter. The doubt. "It isn't gone," he confessed, his gaze dropping to her throat, where her pulse was jumping frantically. "I still look in the mirror and see a boy who made the wrong choices. I still wonder if one day you'll wake up and realize you could have had someone who didn't come with a haunted house." "I don't want someone else," Hermione said, her voice fierce with conviction. She stepped into his space, her hands rising to find the heat of his neck. She felt the fine, silky texture of his hair between her fingers. "I want the man who stayed. I want the father of my son. I want you, Draco." cracks and all. He let out a jagged, broken breath and pulled her closer. His hands settled on her waist, his fingers digging into the fabric of her dress with a possessive strength. The atmospheric pressure in the room reached a fever pitch. "Tell me again," he urged, his forehead pressing against hers. "Tell me you're not going to leave." "I am never leaving," she promised, her voice a soft vow in the darkness. "We are the Foundation now, Draco. Not the ancestors. Not the ghosts. Us." He didn't wait this time. He slanted his mouth over hers in a kiss that was a surrender. It was softer than the one on the balcony, more certain, a lingering exploration of their new reality. It tasted of salt and moonlight and the promise of a night that wasn't defined by fear. As he pulled her deeper into his embrace, Hermione felt the last of the internal conflicts dissolve. The "can't stand it" had long since become "can't breathe without it." The magnetic friction had settled into a steady, glowing warmth. They stood together in the sunroom, two people who had survived a war only to find the hardest battle was the one for each other's trust. The manor stood silent around them, no longer a fortress, but a home. "Come," Draco whispered against her lips, his hand sliding down to interlace his fingers with hers. "Let's go upstairs. The night is far from over." He led her out of the sunroom, their footsteps echoing in a house that finally felt as though it were breathing with them. The walk up the grand staircase was no longer a journey through a museum of his family's sins. It was a path to their future. Outside, the rain had long since stopped, and the stars were beginning to pierce the dark velvet of the Scottish sky. In the nursery, Leo slept, dreaming of lions and dragons, protected by a magic that was no longer a burden, but a bond. And in the master suite, behind doors that were no longer locked, Draco Malfoy finally let the light in. The master suite was bathed in the amber glow of a dying fire, the embers in the hearth pulsing like a living heart. Outside, the Highland wind had settled into a low melodic hum, a soft contrast to the frantic, jagged symphony of the previous night. The air here was different, stripped of the ozone and the scent of ancient, stagnant magic. It smelled of the wood smoke from the fireplace and the faint, lingering fragrance of jasmine from the gardens below. Draco stood by the heavy velvet curtains, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight. He had discarded his shoes, and his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the hollow of his throat, where his breath hitched with every steady, deliberate movement of Hermione's shadow across the wall. She was standing by the edge of the bed, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of the dark wood, serpents and vines that no longer felt like warnings, but merely history. The silence between them had evolved. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating wall of a Cold War. It was a resonant, vibrating space, charged with the electric anticipation of two souls finally standing on the same side of the threshold. "I used to watch you from the doorway," Draco said, his voice a low, velvet rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. He didn't turn around, but his reflection in the dark glass of the window showed eyes that were wide and shimmering. "I would watch you sleep or read, and I would feel like a thief, like I was stealing moments from a life I had no right to touch." Hermione walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. The tactile friction in the air grew with every inch she reclaimed. "You weren't a thief, Draco. You were a prisoner of your own making." She stopped just behind him, her presence a warm weight in his periphery. She reached out, her hand hovering for a heartbeat, before she pressed her palm flat against the center of his back. Through the thin linen of his shirt, she felt the immediate, visceral alignment of his body to her touch. He leaned back into her, a slow, shuddering surrender that made his shoulders drop. "I don't want to be a prisoner anymore," he whispered. He turned in the circle of her arms, his movements fluid and desperate. He looked down at her, his face a map of the night's long journey, the exhaustion, the lingering traces of fear, and a new, terrifyingly bright hope that he seemed almost afraid to blink away. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he tucked a wild, unruly curl behind her ear, his thumb lingering on the curve of her cheekbone. "I love you," he said, the words no longer sounding like a confession under duress, but like a vow. "I think I have loved you since the day you punched me in the face behind the clock tower. I just didn't have the vocabulary for something so pure." A soft, watery laugh escaped Hermione's throat. She reached up, her hands sliding into his hair, pulling him down until their foreheads were pressed together. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Malfoy." "I'm serious, Hermione," he breathed, his eyes searching hers with a raw, unshielded intensity. "I want to earn this. Every day. I want to build something with you that isn't made of stone and old blood. I want Leo to grow up knowing that his father isn't a ghost, but a man who loves his mother more than his own life." The emotional seesaw had finally come to a rest, balanced by the sheer weight of their shared truth. The approach was no longer followed by repulsion. The trust was no longer shadowed by betrayal. Draco leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a series of light, reverent kisses. On her forehead, her eyelids, the tip of her nose, as if he were memorizing her features through touch alone. Each contact was a spark, a building of static that finally culminated when he captured her mouth with a deep, possessive certainty. This kiss was different from the others. It wasn't the frantic explosion of the balcony or the desperate relief of the catacombs. It was slow, deliberate, and achingly sensual. It was the taste of a beginning. His tongue traced the line of her lower lip, a silent request that she granted instantly, her breath hitching as she pulled him closer, her body molding to the hard, familiar lines of his. He swept her up into his arms, his strength effortless, and carried her the short distance to the bed. He laid her down amidst the silk pillows, his gaze never leaving hers. The firelight played across his skin, highlighting the grace of his movements as he joined her, his weight a grounding, welcome pressure. "No more distance," she whispered, her hands finding the buttons of his shirt, her fingers moving with a focused, steady intent. "Never again," he promised. The night deepened around them, but the shadows were powerless. In the quiet intimacy of the room, they rediscovered one another, not as enemies, not as symbols of a fractured world, but as a man and a woman who had fought through the dark to find the light in each other's eyes. Every touch was a conversation, every look a promise. The magnetic pull that had haunted them for years was finally allowed to find its equilibrium. Hours later, as the fire faded to grey ash and the first hint of a new dawn began to pale the eastern sky, Hermione lay curled against Draco's side. His arm was draped over her, his hand resting protectively over hers. Their breathing was synchronized, a rhythmic, peaceful sound that filled the room. Draco stirred, his lips brushing the crown of her head. "He's going to be a handful, you know," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep and a trace of his old dry wit. "Leo. He's already figured out how to lock the library doors. Imagine what he'll do when he gets his first wand." Hermione smiled, closing her eyes as she snuggled deeper into the warmth of his chest. "We'll handle it together, Draco. We're a team now." "A team," he repeated, the words sounding like music. "I like the sound of that." He shifted, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. The morning light caught the silver of his wedding ring, a band that had been a shackle and was now a badge of honor. He leaned down and kissed her one last time, a soft, lingering seal on the night's events. "Go to sleep, Hermione," he whispered. "The house is safe. We're home." As sleep finally claimed her, Hermione felt the steady, unwavering heartbeat of the man beside her. The manor was no longer a place of echoes and cold dinners. It was a place of laughter, of messy curls, and of a love that had proven itself stronger than any ancient curse. Outside, the first bird began to sing in the gardens, a clear, bright sound that heralded a day where the sun would finally stay. The naughty son was fast asleep. The morally grey father was at peace, and the principled mother was finally completely loved. The story of Draco and Hermione was no longer a tragedy of the past, but a beautiful, unfolding novel of the future. The invitation sat on the edge of the vanity, its heavy parchment embossed with the ministry's golden seal, looking like a discarded weapon in the soft, intimate glow of the bedroom. A ministry gala, a celebration of post-war restoration. To the rest of the wizarding world, it was a night of champagne and forced smiles. To Draco, it was a trial by fire. He stood before the full-length mirror, his fingers fumbling with the silver cufflinks, a rare display of uncharacteristic clumsiness. The suit was black, tailored to a perfection that should have felt like armor, but tonight it felt like a shroud. The atmospheric pressure in the room was rising, not from the manor's ancient wards, but from the storm brewing behind Draco's eyes. "I should go alone," he murmured, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He didn't look at Hermione's reflection. He stared at the dark mark hidden beneath his pristine white cuff, the ghost of it still burning in his mind. The whispers, they are manageable when directed at me, but for you to stand there, by my side, after what the prophet hinted about Leo's outburst. Hermione stepped into the frame of the mirror. She was a vision in deep, shimmering emerald silk, the colour of the Malfoy crest, but worn with the defiant grace of a lioness. She didn't answer with words. She stepped into his space, her warmth a visceral alignment against the cold chill radiating from his skin. She reached up, her fingers steady as she brushed his hands away from the silver links. The tactile friction of her skin against his wrists made the muscle in his jaw tick. She took over the task, her movements precise and grounding. "You are doing it again," she whispered, her gaze fixed on his collar. "You are building a wall to protect me, Draco. But all you're doing is leaving me to stand in the cold while you suffer in silence." "It's not silence, Hermione. It's strategy," he countered, though the fight was draining out of him. He looked down at the top of her head, the wild curls pinned back with a silver comb he had given her, a family heirloom that had once belonged to a woman far less brave than she. If I am seen as the solitary, brooding Malfoy, they leave you be. If we go together, we are a target. Then let us be a target, she said, finally looking up. Her brown eyes were fierce, burning with an emotional intensity that demanded his total surrender. I am tired of being your secret. I am tired of you acting as if our marriage is a penance you must serve in isolation. We saved our son together, Draco. Do you truly think a room full of bureaucrats can break what we've built? She finished the cuff and let her hands slide up his chest, her palms resting over the rapid, heavy thud of his heart. The magnetic pull between them was undeniable, a physical weight that drew his head down toward hers. Draco let out a long, shaky exhale, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. They will look at Leo's magic as a threat. They will look at me and see only the boy who let the shadows in. Then let them see the man who ushered the light back, she breathed. He didn't argue further. He couldn't. The internal conflict that had governed his life, the can't stand it versus can't help but think, had finally settled into a singular, profound need for her presence. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him, his face burying in the crook of her neck. He inhaled the scent of her, sandalwood and the sharp, clean ozone of her magic, and felt the final pieces of his resolve click into place. The entrance to the ministry's great hall was a gauntlet of flashes and hushed voices. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the underlying hum of 1,000 low-level spells. As the herald announced them, Lord and Lady Malfoy, the room fell into a silence so absolute it was a jarring impact. Draco felt the old instinct to recoil, to sneer, to put up the mask of the cold aristocrat. His hand, resting on the small of Hermione's back, tightened, his knuckles whitening. But then he felt her. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She took a step forward, her chin tilted at that stubborn Gryffindor angle, her hand sliding down to lace her fingers firmly through his. The public display of non-verbal intimacy was a shock to the system of the wizarding elite. It wasn't the stiff, formal carriage of a political union. It was the visceral, magnetic alignment of two people who were profoundly, devastatingly in love. They moved through the crowd like a single entity. Draco didn't look at the cameras or the judgmental faces of his former peers. He looked only at her. When a high-ranking official approached with a pointed question about the structural instabilities reported at Malfoy Manor, Draco didn't retreat into his usual biting sarcasm. "The manor is more stable than it has been in centuries," Draco said, his voice smooth and carrying a new, quiet authority. He looked down at Hermione, his thumb stroking the back of her hand in a slow, possessive rhythm. "We have cleared away the rot. The foundation is quite whole now." The double meaning wasn't lost on anyone. As the night wore on, the seesaw of public perception began to shift. The repulsion that usually followed the Malfoy name was being eroded by the sheer, undeniable warmth Draco projected toward his wife. He wasn't the broken man the tabloids had painted. He was a guardian. Near the end of the evening, they found themselves on a small, enchanted balcony overlooking the underground fountain. The music from the hall was a faint, melodic echo. Draco leaned against the stone railing, his eyes fixed on Hermione. The tension between them had evolved from the sharp, hostile friction of the library into a deep, simmering heat. "You were right," he admitted, his voice a low, intimate murmur. He reached out, his hand sliding behind her neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin behind her ear. "The targets are much easier to bear when you're the one holding the shield." Hermione leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "We are the shield, Draco." He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. The space between them was incinerating, a gravitational collapse that he no longer sought to avoid. He kissed her, a deep, lingering reclaim of her in the heart of the world that had tried to keep them apart. It wasn't a kiss of desperation, but of triumph. "Let's go home," he whispered against her mouth. "Leo will be waking up soon, and I find I quite dislike being anywhere you aren't." They left the gala not as a scandal, but as a legend. As they stepped into the flue, the green flames reflecting in Draco's silver eyes, he realized that the truth wasn't just in the words they spoke, but in the way they stood together, unbroken, unashamed, and finally unequivocally free. The manor was waiting for them, no longer a cage of shadows, but a sanctuary where the light was finally allowed to stay. And as Draco led Hermione up the grand staircase, his hand never leaving hers, he knew that the resonance of the truth they had found would outlast any rumor, any war, and any ghost. The gardens of Malfoy Manor had transitioned from a manicured graveyard of ancestral pride into a vibrant, wild sanctuary. It was a golden Saturday afternoon, the kind where the sun felt like a physical weight on one's shoulders, warm and thick as honey. Hermione sat on a stone bench near the edge of the rose garden, a stack of ministry files forgotten by her side. Her attention was entirely focused on the two figures standing in the center of the great lawn. Leo was 6 now, a height that seemed to change by the week, and today he was vibrating with a specific electric brand of excitement. In his hand, he held a training wand, a simple slip of rowan that didn't yet channel a full magical core, but acted as a conduit for a child's intent. Draco stood behind him, his tall, lean frame casting a protective shadow over the boy. He wasn't the rigid, distant instructor he might have been a year ago. He was dressed in a simple charcoal sweater, sleeves pushed up, his posture relaxed, but his eyes intensely focused. "The magic of our family, Leo, isn't just about what you can destroy." Draco's voice carried across the grass, low and resonant, stripped of its old aristocratic ice. The oldest Malfoy magic was stellar. It was about the alignment of the stars, finding the light in the deepest part of the night. "Do you understand?" Leo nodded solemnly, his silver-grey eyes, so like his father's, wide with wonder. "Like the stars in the library ceiling?" "Exactly," Draco murmured. He placed his hand over Leo's small one, his long fingers guiding the boy's grip on the rowan wand. The tactile friction between them was a beautiful thing to witness, a bond forged in the fires of the catacombs and tempered by months of shared breakfasts and bedtime stories. "Close your eyes. Don't look for the light with your sight. Look for it with your breath." Hermione held her breath. She knew how much this cost Draco. For years, he had associated his family heritage with the dark, the stagnant, and the cursed. Teaching Leo the Malfoy magic was his final act of reclamation, taking back the ancient, pure roots of his lineage and pruning away the rot of the last century. "Focus, Leo," Draco whispered. "Find the center, the place where you feel most safe." A soft, melodic hum began to vibrate through the air. The atmospheric pressure in the garden shifted, a gentle magnetic pull that made the surrounding roses sway as if caught in a localized breeze. From the tip of Leo's wand, a tiny, pulsing spark of silver-gold light emerged. It didn't flicker or lash out with chaotic energy. It glowed with a steady, serene brilliance. "I see it, Daddy," Leo chirped, his eyes snapping open. "Keep it steady," Draco encouraged, his own magic beginning to bleed into the air to support the boy's efforts. "Guide it. It's part of you." With a slow, careful arc, Leo moved the wand. The spark expanded, stretching into a thin, shimmering thread of light that began to weave itself into a shape. It wasn't a lion or a dragon. It was a constellation, a perfect miniature replica of the Great Bear, hanging in the air just above their heads. The magic was a perfect blend of both parents, the precise intellectual structure of Hermione's logic and the raw celestial power of Draco's bloodline. It was a heritage of lions and dragons, transformed into something entirely new. "It's beautiful," Hermione said, stepping off the bench and walking toward them. Her heart felt so full, it was a physical ache in her chest. Draco looked up as she approached, and the expression on his face made her knees weak. There was no trace of the broken man she had married 5 years ago. He looked whole. He looked like a man who had finally stopped apologizing for his own existence. "He did it," Draco said, his voice thick with a pride that was entirely devoid of arrogance. He let go of Leo's hand, allowing the boy to chase the floating light constellation as it drifted toward the fountain. Draco turned to Hermione, catching her hands in his. The contact was instant and grounding, a visceral alignment of their shared life. He pulled her closer, his thumbs stroking the back of her knuckles in that familiar, possessive rhythm. "I thought it would be dark," he confessed softly, his gaze following Leo. "I thought if I tapped into the bloodline, the shadows would come back. But he turned it into stars." "Because he's not just a Malfoy, Draco," Hermione reminded him, reaching up to brush a stray silver-blonde hair from his forehead. "He's yours, and mine. He is the best parts of us." Draco's eyes darkened with a familiar, simmering heat. He pulled her into the crook of his arm, his chin resting on the top of her head. The magnetic pull in the garden was no longer a storm. It was a sun-drenched peace. "I spent so long running from the past," Draco murmured into her hair. "I didn't realize that the future was standing right in front of me, waiting for me to just open the door." They stood there for a long time, watching their son play with the stars he had created. The manor stood in the background, its windows reflecting the golden afternoon light, no longer a fortress of secrets, but a home filled with the sounds of a life being lived. "What's next?" Hermione asked, leaning back to look at him. Draco smiled, a real, unshielded smile that reached his eyes. "Next, I think I might take my wife for a walk by the lake. And perhaps, if we're lucky, we can convince the naughty son that he needs a nap so I can have you all to myself." Hermione laughed, the sound bright and clear, echoing through the gardens. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down for a kiss that tasted of sunshine and redemption. The struggle was over. The "can't stand it" had been replaced by a "can't imagine anything else." As they walked toward the lake, their fingers interlaced and their magic humming in perfect, quiet harmony, they weren't the ghosts of a war or the products of a law. They were simply a family, rooted in a foundation that was finally, permanently, and beautifully stable. The heritage of the lions and the dragons had finally found its peace in the light of the stars. The final transformation of Malfoy Manor did not happen with a grand ritual or a public proclamation. It happened in the quiet, rhythmic sounds of a blacksmith's hammer echoing from the old forge at the edge of the estate. For centuries, the library doors had been reinforced with ancient, cold iron, metal enchanted to keep people out, to guard secrets, and to symbolize the impenetrable isolation of the Malfoy name. Those were the same locks that had trapped Draco and Hermione on the night the storm broke their silence. Draco stood by the glowing coals of the forge, the heat reflecting in the silver of his eyes. He had shed his fine robes for a simple linen shirt, sleeves rolled past his elbows, his skin glistening with the exertion of the task. He wasn't casting spells to reshape the metal. He was doing it by hand, feeling the resistance of the iron, reclaiming the physical world he had once shunned in favor of cold, distant magic. Hermione watched him from the doorway, her heart swelling with a quiet, profound pride. She saw the way he handled the hammer, not as a weapon, but as a tool of creation. The iron that had once been a barrier was being melted down, stripped of its old restrictive enchantments, and forged into something new. "It's almost ready," Draco said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the metallic ring of the forge. He set the hammer down and wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his gaze turning to her. "The garden gate, the one that will never be locked." "A gate that stays open," Hermione murmured, walking toward him. The atmospheric pressure in the forge was heavy with heat and the scent of singed metal, but the magnetic pull between them was as steady and cooling as a mountain stream. "It's a beautiful thought, Draco." "It's more than a thought," he replied, stepping away from the anvil to meet her. He caught her waist with his hands, his touch warm and certain. "It's a promise. No more rooms that lock people in. No more secrets that turn into walls. If Leo wants to run into the woods, he can. If the world wants to see us, they can. We aren't hiding anymore." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, his breath hitching as he inhaled the scent of her. The visceral alignment of their lives was complete. The seesaw of their relationship had finally found its perfect center, a balance of her fire and his cool silver, her logic and his instinct. The afternoon that followed was a masterpiece of domestic peace. They moved the new gate to the entrance of the sprawling wildflower meadow that Hermione had planted to replace the rigid, formal hedges of the past. Together, they set the hinges into the stone. Leo was there too, helping guide the heavy metal with small rhythmic pulses of his silver-gold magic, his face twisted in a mask of adorable concentration. When the last bolt was tightened, the gate swung open with a silent, fluid grace. It didn't shriek like the old iron of the catacombs. It hummed with the resonance of a house that was finally breathing. "Done," Draco announced, wiping his soot-stained hands on a rag before scooping Leo up and tossing him onto his shoulder. The boy's laughter was a bright silver bell in the quiet of the afternoon. As the sun began to descend, painting the sky in violent shades of orange, violet, and bruised gold, the family made their way down to the edge of the Black Lake. The water was a dark mirror, reflecting the ancient trees and the high, shimmering peaks of the highlands. The naughty son had finally exhausted himself, his head lolling against Draco's shoulder as he watched the giant squid lazily break the surface of the water. "He's almost out," Hermione whispered, her hand finding Draco's free one. Their fingers interlaced instantly, a habitual grounding contact. "He's had a big day," Draco replied, his voice a low, intimate rasp. He looked out over the water, his profile etched in the golden light. The scars of the past, both the physical ones on his arm and the invisible ones in his mind, seemed to have faded into the background, becoming nothing more than the texture of a life well lived. We all have. They sat together on a weathered wooden bench under the sprawling canopy of an ancient willow tree. The long, trailing branches dipped into the water, creating a curtain of green that shielded them from the rest of the world. Draco shifted Leo so the boy could sleep comfortably on his chest. Then he pulled Hermione close, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "I used to think that peace was something you had to earn through suffering," Draco said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I thought if I didn't feel the weight of my mistakes every second, I was failing at my penance. But sitting here, I realize that peace is just the absence of fear, and I haven't been afraid in a long time." Hermione leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing as she soaked in the warmth of him. "You didn't just earn it, Draco. You built it. We built it." The magnetic pull between them was no longer a frantic, desperate thing. It was a slow, deep glow, like the embers of a fire that would never go out. Draco turned his head, his lips brushing her temple, then her cheek, before finally finding her mouth. The kiss was the culmination of their entire journey. It wasn't the collision of enemies or the frantic rescue of parents. It was a kiss of total, unadulterated surrender. It was the taste of home. Draco's hand moved from her shoulder to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her throat as he pulled her deeper into the embrace. The world outside the willow tree vanished, leaving only the two of them and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of their sleeping son between them. When they finally broke apart, the stars were beginning to pierce the dark velvet of the sky. The manor stood in the distance, its windows glowing with a warm, welcoming light. It was no longer a fortress or a museum of sins. It was a place where a small boy would grow up knowing he was loved, and where a man and a woman had turned a political edict into a legendary romance. "I love you, Hermione Malfoy," Draco whispered into the quiet of the night, his voice thick with a raw, unshielded emotion. "And I love you, Draco," she replied, her fingers tightening in his. They sat there for a long time, watching the stars align over the highlands, the same stars that Draco had taught Leo to find. The heritage of the lions and the dragons was no longer a story of conflict, but a foundation of strength. The iron was melted, the gates were open, and the light had finally, permanently found its way home. As Draco stood to carry their son back to the house, he paused one last time to look at the open gate in the distance. He smiled, a small, private expression of triumph, before leaning down to give Hermione one more lingering, sweet kiss. The story of the Malfoys was no longer a tragedy written in shadows. It was a love story, written in the stars, and it was only just beginning.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is about more than just magic. It is about the walls we build around our hearts. Sometimes we hide because we are afraid, We think our past makes us unworthy of love, but Draco and Hermione show us something important. They show us that light can find a way, even in the darkness house. It takes courage to open a locked door. It takes even more courage to let someone truly see you. I hope this story reminded you of one thing. No matter how many mistakes you have made, you deserve a second chance. You deserve to find a home where you don't have to hide. What was your favorite moment? Was it the library or the garden? Please tell me in the comments. I love reading your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. See you in the next one. Goodbye.